All right, welcome back to the Quadruple D, and this is part two of what I call episode 61. And today we're going to be talking about who was Ali Khamenei. So, Ali Husseini Khamenei was born in April 1939, and he, of course, died on the 28th of February in 2026. He was assassinated. He led the Islamic Republic of Iran for more than 3.5 decades. From 1989 until his assassination in 2026, he held the post of Supreme Leader, a position that stands above the presidency and parliament and gives final authority over the armed forces and the judiciary and state broadcasting. Before that, he served two terms as president from 1981 to 1989 during the brutal Iran Iraq War. By the time of his death, he was the longest serving head of state in the Middle East. So I suppose that could be a bit of a milestone in its own way. So Khomeini was born in Mashhad into a clerical family and trained in Shia seminaries, first in his hometown and later in Qum, the main center of uh, 12er Shia scholarship in Iran. And he attended lectures by Khomeini, who has a similar name, but of course he was the central figure of the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. And under the monarchy of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Khomeini was arrested several times for political activism and spent years under surveillance and internal exile. Like many clerics aligned with Khomeini, he opposed the Shah's US backed modernization drive, which combined rapid capitalist development with authoritarian rule enforced by the secret police called SAVAK or SAVAK. And after the 1979 revolution overthrew the monarchy, Khamenei moved quickly into positions of power in the new Islamic Republic. In 1981, a bomb attack severely injured him and left his right arm partly paralyzed. That same year, amid factional struggles and mass repression of leftists, nationalists, and Kurdish groups, he was elected president. And during the Iran Iraq War, the state consolidated power through wartime mobilization, executions of political prisoners, and the expansion of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, or the IRGC, a parallel military force created to defend the revolution. And Khamenei built close ties with the IRGC leadership in that period. So when Khomeini died in 1989, the similarly named leader Khomeini, when he died in 1989, the Assembly of Experts selected Khomeini as supreme leader. At the time, he did not hold the rank of Grand Ayatollah, and his elevation required both constitutional revision and rapid religious promotion. And this moment demonstrated how religious authority and state power fused in the Islamic Republic. You had a hierarchical clerical title that was effectively secured through some political maneuvering and state media and security backing rather than broad consent. As supreme leader, Khamenei presided over a system that concentrates sovereignty in unelected bodies. The Guardian Council vets candidates for office. The judiciary answers to the leader. The IRGC grew into an economic and military powerhouse, controlling construction firms, telecommunications assets, and major energy projects through conglomerates. And although privatization policies were promoted under his watch, much of the transferred wealth shifted from formal state ministries to foundations and security linked entities, limiting worker control and independent unions. Strikes by teachers, oil workers, and pensioners were frequently met with arrests. So, this is not a progressive figure by any means. On nuclear policy, Khomeini publicly supported uranium enrichment for civilian energy and medical research, citing Iran's rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. He also issued a religious decree against nuclear weapons. Western governments remained skeptical, and, well, they lied about it as well. And it led to severe sanctions that restricted oil exports and access to global banking. Those sanctions, combined with domestic mismanagement and corruption, contributed to inflation, currency collapse, and periodic protests, including the 2009 Green Movement and the 2022 uprising after the death of Amini in morality police custody. Regionally, Khomeini advanced what officials call the axis of resistance, backing allied governments and armed groups in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza. Iran provided military aid to the Syrian government during its civil war and supported militias in Iraq that fought both ISIS and US forces. So keep that in mind. This, the government of Iran was not allied with ISIS. And it also supplied weapons and training to Hezbollah in Lebanon and to the Houthis in Yemen. So these interventions reinforced state militarism across the region, empowering armed hierarchies rather than grassroots self-organization. At the same time, Iran faced hostility from the United States, from Israel, obviously, and Saudi Arabia, resulting in covert operations, cyber attacks, targeted killings, and proxy confrontations. Whole bunch of fun stuff, in other words. Khomeini was a vocal opponent of Israel and Zionism and consistently endorsed Palestinian resistance. His rhetoric sometimes crossed into anti Semitic tropes, which of course a lot of people would criticize him for, and it drew international condemnation. And tensions with Israel and the United States escalated in the mid 2020s into direct clashes, sometimes described as the 12-Day War, followed by continued conflict in which he was ultimately assassinated this year. So, his supporters portrayed him as a guardian of revolutionary independence against foreign domination. Critics, including many Iranian workers, I mispronounce that word sometimes, and feminists, students, and ethnic minorities, experienced his rule as deeply authoritarian. His long tenure goes to show that revolutionary movements can harden into centralized states that reproduce hierarchy, suppress dissent, and rely on military and clerical elites to maintain control. So basically, same old bullshit, different package. All right, now I'm going to move into the other segment of this episode, which I tend to call the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And this time we're looking at Khomeini. So, again, it's easy to get their names mixed up because they are very similar. But, the biggest and most widely cited scandal involving Ruhollah Khomeini is the 1988 mass execution of political prisoners in Iran. And I'm also going to look at, like I so often do on this show, how this situation actually further validates or proves certain anarchic critiques of political power and government in general. So let's look at the 1988 prison executions. In the final months of the Iran Iraq War, thousands of political prisoners, many already serving sentences, were executed after brief interrogations by so called death commissions. No subtlety there with what they were. Sometimes when they form these groups, they don't really try to conceal what they're up to. The primary targets were members of alleged supporters of the opposition group People's Mujahideen of Iran, or the MEK, along with leftists, communists, and other dissidents. And like I often have to do here, when people accuse some of being leftist or communist, it doesn't necessarily always mean they were those things. In fact, they might not have always been rebels at all in some cases. So you really have to, consider the propaganda efforts that were going on at the time and take it on a case by case basis, because there have always been some people in these sort of political persecution periods, in these different countries. That there's always some lack of clarity about exactly who was targeted and why, because sometimes people just lie and say that somebody was a radical when they actually weren't. That happened during the Red Scare, to a significant degree, and I'm sure it happened here as well in this situation. But anyway, the executions were based on a secret fatwa attributed to Khomeini. Prisoners were reportedly asked a few ideological questions. Wrong answers could mean immediate execution. Estimates of the number killed range from several thousand to over 5,000, though exact figures remain disputed because the Iranian government has never released full records. Big surprise there, right? And one of the most significant pieces of evidence is an audio recording released in 2016 by Hossein Ali Montazari, who was then Khomeini's designated successor. In the recording, Montazeri criticizes the executions and calls them the greatest crime in the Islamic Republic. Shortly after opposing the policy, he was removed from succession. So, for critics of the regime, this event represents the clearest case of large scale state repression. Well, you could just call it state violence, directly tied to Khomeini's authority. So let's do that anarchic assessment that I was talking about. What do those silly Billy, wild-eyed, goofball, radical, anarchic type, what do they think about this? What do those types of people argue about this? So to those silly Billies, the issue is not only the brutality of the act, but what it reveals about state power itself. So let's get into the basic aspect of centralized authority here. So anarchism would reject hierarchical political authority, and the Islamic Republic under Khomeini was built under the doctrine of rule of the jurist, as they called it. And there's a special word for that, but I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I'm just, I'm just not good at pronouncing a lot of foreign words. But anyway, the rule of the jurist concentrated ultimate authority in a single unelected religious leader. So, from a sort of anarchic view, this structure almost guarantees abuse. When power is centralized and insulated from accountability, repression becomes structurally easier. So, perfectly predictable outcome. So, you've also got the fusion of religion and state. Anarchist thought, especially in its anti clerical strands, is deeply skeptical of religious institutions wielding political power. And the executions illustrate how theological legitimacy can be used to frame political dissent as moral or divine betrayal. And in this framework, dissent is not just opposition, but heresy. And what do you know? It makes the likelihood of violence all that more real, And the suppression of dissent is, of course, evident here. That kind of goes without saying almost, but just to emphasize the point. And anarchism emphasizes freedom of association and expression, at least if it's, if it's done right. So executing prisoners for ideological positions represents the extreme opposite of that principle. The short interrogations, the lack of due process, and secrecy align with what anarchists criticize as the coercive core of the state, and also the secrecy element. That's sort of like an admission that what they're doing is wrong and would make them look bad. if there was, a full spotlight on it. So definitely, when it's not like secrecy is always bad, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, if a person's parents are having sex, they probably want it to be secret from the kids or something. But this is obviously a little bit different from that sort of secrecy. This is like, we're murdering people that happen to disagree with us, and we're doing it based on no evidence and with no crime, uh, other than the person we don't like disagreeing with us. Well, at least in most cases. And of course, even if there were a few people who were legitimately punished for some horrible thing that they did, the fact that they were all lumped in together, um, and there was no accountability, no due process, it makes it so that the whole process would be tarnished. So that's why you need something like, you know uh, a, a a clear process by which these decisions are made. It's not like you would fully agree with every decision that a court system makes, but this was actually like plainly not a legitimate court system pretty much at all. And that it's another revolutionary betrayal too, because it it's unfortunately the case that whenever there is a potential for, sort of a true progressive era to take place, that quite often these authoritarians will swoop in and fill that power vacuum. So I'm sure some anarchists would frame the 1979 Iranian Revolution as an example of how revolutionary movements can just replace one hierarchy with another. The overthrow of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi removed a monarchy, but from the anarchic perspective, it did not eliminate domination. It restructured it under religious authority, and of course, thousands of people just had to be sacrificed for their version of God. So there's a broader context here. Supporters of Khomeini argue that the executions occurred during wartime, following an armed incursion by the MEK aligned with Iraq. They framed the event as a national security measure in a moment of existential crisis. But, critics, including human rights organizations, rightly view it as a crime against humanity. And if you are going to inflict punishments, they should be done for actual crimes, like moments of violence or something like that, not just, oh, this person disagrees with me. Therefore, we're going to have a little bit of a private interrogation, and we're just going to execute them if they say the wrong thing or something like that. So from the strictly anarchic standpoint, the wartime context does not justify the consolidation of lethal authority in the hands of the state. The scandal is not only about the numbers killed, it's about the demonstration uh, that when a state claims moral or divine infallibility, dissenters can be eliminated with little internal resistance. And I always distrust somebody when they say that their political movement is totally infallible and that it's, anointed by God, or however they want to phrase it. You know, that's basically begging for resistance. And it's a declaration that they are actually illegitimate, because if you have to hide behind a god, you're probably doing something wrong. Okay.